The Soviet decision before Kursk was one of the most important choices of the entire campaign because it turned patience into a weapon. In the spring of 1943, the Red Army held the great salient around Kursk, a dangerous bulge projecting westward into German lines. The obvious German answer was to attack its shoulders, cut it off, and destroy the Soviet forces inside. Soviet leaders understood that danger, but instead of rushing to spoil the attack with their own offensive, they made a colder and more disciplined choice. They would absorb the German blow, force it to break against prepared depth, and then counterattack when the attacking force had spent its strength. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. This decision was not automatic because the Soviet Union had its own reasons to want the initiative. After Stalingrad, the Red Army had gained confidence, and its commanders were increasingly capable of planning large operations across wide fronts. There was a strong temptation to strike first, to deny the Germans time to prepare, and to show that the strategic momentum had passed to Moscow. Soviet offensive doctrine also emphasized action, pressure, and the importance of not allowing the enemy to choose the terms of battle. But Kursk demanded a different kind of confidence. It required Soviet commanders to believe that defense could be active, not passive, and that waiting could serve a larger operational purpose if the battlefield was prepared correctly. At the center of the argument stood Joseph Stalin and the senior military leadership around him, including Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, two of the most influential Soviet commanders of the war. Stalin had often favored offensive action, especially when political and military momentum seemed to support it. But by 1943, Soviet high command had learned painfully that enthusiasm could not substitute for preparation. Zhukov and Vasilevsky helped persuade Stalin that the Kursk salient offered a rare opportunity to make the Germans attack on Soviet terms. The Red Army would not simply hide behind trenches. It would construct a defensive system deep enough to absorb shock, gather intelligence on German movements, and hold powerful reserves for the moment when defense could become attack. The intelligence picture mattered greatly. Soviet leaders did not know every detail of German planning, but they understood the broad outline of Operation Citadel well enough. German forces were massing north and south of the salient, and the shape of the front made their likely objectives clear. Reports from reconnaissance, partisans, intercepted signals, and other intelligence channels helped confirm that the Germans were preparing a major armored offensive. This knowledge did not remove uncertainty, because war never offers perfect information. It did, however, change the character of the choice. The Soviets were not gambling blindly that the Germans might come. They were judging where the blow was likely to fall and using time to make that blow less decisive. That use of time was the real Soviet achievement. Every delay in the German attack gave the Red Army more weeks to dig, mine, register artillery, organize supply dumps, rehearse counterattacks, and move reserves into depth. This was not glamorous work, and it is easy to underestimate because it lacks the drama of charging tanks. But modern armored warfare is often decided before the visible battle begins. A minefield laid in the right place can break the timing of a panzer attack. An anti-tank gun dug in with good fields of fire can force armored vehicles to turn, slow, or bunch together. Artillery pre-planned against roads and assembly areas can disrupt movement before tanks even reach the forward line.
The Soviet concept was defense in depth, and that phrase deserves to be understood plainly. It meant that the Germans would not face a single defensive line, whose rupture would decide the campaign. Instead, they would encounter successive belts of resistance, one behind another. Each meant to slow them, damage them, and force them to fight again. Trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, strong points, artillery positions, and reserves were arranged so that a breakthrough in one place would not automatically become freedom of movement. This was a direct answer to the German method of armored warfare. If panzer formations depended on turning a breach into rapid exploitation, then the Soviet defense aimed to make every breach incomplete, costly, and temporary.
This choice also showed how far the Red Army had come since the disasters of 1941. Early in the German invasion, Soviet formations had often been surprised, isolated, and destroyed before they could coordinate an effective response. Command structures collapsed, communications failed, and reserves arrived too late or in pieces. By 1943, many problems remained, and Soviet operations could still be blunt and costly. Yet the Red Army had become more resilient and more disciplined in operational planning. It was learning how to integrate infantry, artillery, armor, engineers, air power, reconnaissance, and logistics into a single design. At Kursk, that design was not merely to stop tanks at the front edge, but to break the tempo of an entire armored offensive. The commanders responsible for the Kursk defenses had different sectors and different problems. In the north, Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front faced the German attack expected from the Ural region. In the south, Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh Front faced the more dangerous approach from the Belgorod and Kharkov area, where German armored forces would later make deeper gains. Behind them stood Ivan Konev's Steppe Front, a powerful reserve formation held back for the moment when it could either seal a crisis or support a counteroffensive. This arrangement reflected the larger Soviet idea. The first defenders would absorb and slow the attack. The deeper reserves would preserve freedom of action. The most important troops were not always the ones firing first. Holding reserves required discipline because battle creates constant demands for reinforcement. A commander under pressure always wants more tanks, more infantry, more artillery, and more aircraft immediately. The danger is that reserves can be fed into the fight too early, used up in local emergencies, and unavailable when the decisive moment arrives. At Kursk, the Soviet High Command tried to resist that temptation. The purpose of the defensive belts was to make the Germans pay for progress, while the deeper formations remained intact. This was patience with a sharp edge. The Soviets were not waiting because they were weak. They were waiting because they wanted the German attack to reveal its main effort, lose momentum, and become vulnerable to a larger answer. The terrain reinforced the logic of this decision. The Kursk region offered open spaces where tanks could move, but also villages, streams, ridges, roads, and fields that could be organized for defense. Engineers and labor battalions turned that terrain into a system of obstacles and killing zones. Mines were especially important because they did not have to destroy every tank to be effective. A few disabled vehicles could block lanes, slow columns, and force engineers forward under fire. Once the attack slowed, artillery and anti-tank guns had more time to work. In armored warfare, delay is not just inconvenience. Delay changes the battle, because tanks that should be moving fast become exposed machines waiting in danger. Air power and reconnaissance also shaped the Soviet choice to wait. Both sides understood that the sky above Kursk would influence what could be seen, struck, and concealed. Soviet forces needed to know where German armored concentrations were forming, while also protecting their own reserves and supply movements from German air attack. The Red Air Force had improved since the early disasters of the war, though it still faced a dangerous Luftwaffe. Waiting did not mean surrendering the air or sitting helplessly under bombardment. It meant preparing a whole defensive environment in which aircraft, artillery, ground observers, and reconnaissance units could help identify the direction of the main attack and support the response. There was a moral burden in this strategy that should not be overlooked. Choosing to receive the German blow meant that forward Soviet troops would endure the first shock of some of the strongest armored formations Germany still possessed. Infantrymen in trenches, gun crews in prepared positions, engineers near mine belts, and tank crews held in local reserve would pay heavily for the time the larger plan required. The Soviet command knew that the defense would be costly. It expected losses, and the Red Army's willingness to absorb them was part of the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front. Yet the alternative, a premature offensive into German strength, might have wasted Soviet power before the decisive opportunity appeared. The choice to wait was therefore not gentle. It was harsh, calculated, and operationally serious. The brilliance of the decision lies in its sequence. First, make the German plan predictable. Then, prepare the ground so that predictability becomes dangerous. Then, force the German armored formations to fight through depth instead of racing through open space. Finally, when their momentum has weakened, shift from defense to counteroffensive. This sequence is what gives Kursk its larger meaning in the evolution of tank warfare. It shows that the answer to armored attack was not simply thicker armor or bigger guns, though both mattered. The answer was a system. Intelligence, defense in depth, mines, artillery, reserves, communications, logistics, and timing. Tanks were central, but the battle would be decided by the organization of the whole battlefield. The choice to wait did not guarantee victory, and it did not make the coming battle easy. German forces would still break into the defensive belts, inflict severe losses, and create real crises, especially in the south. Soviet commanders would still have to decide when to commit reserves and when to hold them back. Some counterattacks would be costly, and not every local decision would be wise. But the central choice gave the Red Army something Germany increasingly lacked: a campaign design that matched strategic reality. Germany needed a quick decision. The Soviet Union prepared a battle in which quick decision would be almost impossible. That is why the waiting mattered so much. Before the tanks at Kursk collided in mass, the defenders had already begun to win the contest over time.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.